So we're set. So guys, this is what I have planned for today is to watch Billy and Pete. Billy's on top. Pete's on the bottom.
I wouldn't have it any other way.
These two guys are my fellow agnostic atheist friends. Very bright, intelligent guys. But get this, they have no idea who Lee Strobel is. They've never heard of him before. They don't know who he is. And so I thought it would be kind of cool to play a bit of his video. We're just going to let it play and then stop it and hear comments for the very first time of these guys hearing Lee. And I got a lot of comments of my own. And so let's see how it goes. So if you guys want to, Billy, Pete, if you want to say something, just let me know when to pause it.
Just said to the Chicago Cubs,
pause it.
Don't do anything till I get back.
I was just testing to see.
As all
God
good
bless
apologists
them,
do,
baseball,
he gives an obligatory
That's
joke.
Good. That's a good thing. My story, and it's a story that begins in atheism. Because I decided at a fairly young age, initially as a teenager, that God does not and cannot exist. I thought that, God didn't create people, but people created God. Why? Because they were afraid of death. And so they made up this idea of heaven and an afterlife and so forth to make themselves feel better about dying. That's what I thought.
Okay, now, so basically he's saying he used to be an atheist. Now, Billy, before we went live, made a good comment. You want to reiterate what you said, Billy?
I think I said that, well, you're asking me, am I interested in listening to what he has to say after this intro? And I said, well, the fact that he said he used to be an atheist makes me curious on why he was an atheist. Because I've heard that from religious people before in similar terms where, like I said, oh, well, I'm more identified with like a secular humanist. And they're like, oh, I used to be a secular humanist like you, and I believe this, this, and this. And I'm like, none of that really has anything to do with secular humanism. You were just saying that to try to identify with me or try to win me over, but it's clear you don't really know what you're talking about. So I'm curious, what kind of an atheist was he? Did he have a good reason to be an atheist or what?
Yeah, that's a good point. And someone in the chat made a good point too, that he was a teen atheist. And when you're a teenager, I don't know, like, was he 13 when he was an atheist? Was he 14? Did he really know what the word meant? And this is, I don't think I'm doing any spoiler alerts here, but his dad was a Lutheran, I think a committed Lutheran. So the concept of God, he wasn't raised in an atheist home, I do not believe. And I think his mom died at an early age, and I could be wrong about that as well. Someone in chat can correct me if I'm wrong.
He was a teen atheist like Michael J. Fox was a teen wolf. It's somewhere along those lines.
What from the first minute that we listened to, what's your perception of him as a person? Is he likable? Not likable? Does he grate so far under your skin? Or
he's got the dad vibe.
No strong opinions yet.
Okay, no strong opinions. Here we go.
I just thought the mere concept of an all-loving and all-knowing and all-powerful creator of the universe, that's crazy. That's not even worth my time to check out. Now, granted, I tend to be a skeptical person. My background's in journalism and law. You imagine you put those two things together, what kind of a jerk, skeptic that you get. I was legal editor of the Chicago Tribune newspaper, and we used to pride ourselves on our skepticism. We didn't want to accept anybody's word at face value. We always tried to get at least two sources to confirm a fact before we print it in the newspaper. So no kidding, we had a sign in our newsroom that said, if your mother says she loves you, check it out. How do you know? Maybe she's lying. Got any proof? Got any evidence? You got any facts to back that up? That's the kind of skepticism we had. And that's good, isn't it? Don't you want journalists to be skeptical? Yeah.
Don't you want journalists to be skeptical? Yeah. Don't you? I wonder if he would say the same thing about Christians. Don't you want Christians to be skeptical? Yeah.
I think he would say yes to that.
I hope so.
I think it's funny that he says he used to be a skeptic, and the two, and as most atheists associate skepticism with science, and then he associates skepticism with journalism and law.
Yes.
Like when it comes to finding the truth, those are the two least likely things, in my opinion, to lead you to the truth.
Yes, law and journalism.
Well,
I was thinking the same thing.
Those are ways to find sources to confirm what conclusion you're trying to convince other people of, not the truth.
Yeah, I agree, Billy. I don't think that just to say that you used to be a journalist or a lawyer would automatically mean that you're a skeptic. That's a good point. But I just did a Frank Turek video where what was the line? Frank Turek said that, yeah, if our young Christians go to universities nowadays, there's these skeptics there, and he said something else, but it was a negative way. He viewed skepticism in a negative light, and here Lee Strobel is viewing skepticism, if we take him at face value, in a positive light. So that I at least like.
They should be. Here's the problem. My skepticism sort of bubbled over into cynicism, and it cemented me into my atheism. Now, because I was an atheist, because I had no belief in God, I really lacked a moral framework for my life. And I'm not saying this is true of all atheists. I'm just saying that my conclusion was, if there is no God, if there is no ultimate accountability, if there is no heaven, if there is no hell, then the most logical way to live my life would be as a hedonist, someone who just pursues pleasure.
Can you pause it there? Now, if he's truly a skeptic, wouldn't he be skeptical about that? Like, if there's no heaven, no hell, how do you jump to, well, the only way to live your life then is to be a hedonist? It seems to me that he didn't think of any alternative ways to lead his life if he didn't.
Well, I appreciate that he said that, not all atheists are like that, but for him, that's the conclusion he came to. But even then, what I would say to him, maybe being a part of being a hedonist, seeking pleasure, maybe the best way to seek this pleasure is to help others, to be compassionate to others. Maybe that's the ultimate pleasure to be garnered in life. And even some Christians admit that, like, doing the Lord's work in a way makes them feel good, and so they feel a little guilty about that for being selfish. And some Christians say, no, it's totally okay to have that feeling of pleasure and that feel good feeling when you're helping others because you're doing the Lord's will, and it's fine. And so, yeah, I find it interesting that he went automatically to, there is no God, therefore I just need to seek pleasure, and that's it. But let's find out what he means by seeking pleasure.
I also want to say, for the record, before we came on here, I predicted what his story would be. I prayed to God and I asked for the answer. And God told me that he had some sort of life episode, doing some drugs, some partying. It went a little bit wild. And then it got to a certain point where he wasn't feeling great about himself, had some sort of revelation, or met someone who told him of Jesus or something like that, and then researched it on his own and realized that this is what he had been missing in his life.
Right.
I haven't heard this yet. And I'm just gonna.
This, and again, for people who came in late, Pete and Billy have never heard Lee Strobel before, and so Pete's just making a prediction. This is what's going to happen. So let's see if he's right.
And so that's what I did. And the truth is, I lived a very immoral and drunken and profane and narcissistic and self-absorbed and really self-destructive kind of a life. That was my life. What people saw was me winning awards for investigative reporting. What they didn't see was me literally drunk in the snow in an alley on Saturday night. Had a lot of anger inside of me, a lot of rage inside of me. If you ask me, what's the deal? Why the anger? Why the rage? I couldn't have told you, but looking back, I know what it was. I was always after the perfect high. I was always after the ultimate experience of pleasure. And guess what? Everything let me down.
Okay, so I've conducted a lot of interviews, and whenever I experience or talk to someone who entered into a God belief later on in life, like let's say mid-20s or later, my first prediction is addiction. And I would say the majority of the time, I am correct. Maybe at least 6 times out of 10. And the other times out of 10, there's some type of tragedy or a phenomenal experience. Like they had a vision of someone sitting on a bed right next to him, or the devil being in their room, pinning them to their bed, these types of things. And so it's the same for Lee Strobel. And here's some background for you guys that I don't believe he talks about in this video, but I know this from other things, other research. Lee Strobel's dad at one time told him, there's not enough love for you in my one finger. His dad basically, they had a split. So he never had a good relationship with his father. And his mother, I think, died when he was young or younger. And so here you have a man who was seeking the affection of his dad, didn't get it, and became successful. It reminds me a bit of Jeff Durbin. Jeff Durbin was very successful in the martial arts, and I couldn't handle the success. And I don't think maybe Lee Strobel could handle the success of being a successful journalist, and took to the bottle. Any comments from you guys?
So, yeah, it sounds like... So he says, well, if heaven and hell don't exist, then I might as well be a hedonist. And to him, a hedonist means seeking a life of pleasure. And his description of a life of pleasure is being drunk in the street filled with rage. It's like, I don't think you did it right. Like, if you're gonna be a hedonist, do pleasurable things. Like, apparently, what he thought was pleasurable didn't give him any pleasure. Like that, it doesn't seem to add up there. It's like your description of a hedonist is somebody who's sad and angry, but at the same time leads a life of pleasure. Like I think if you were really a hedonist, you wouldn't have an issue with that.
Yeah, he was a terrible hedonist. So that's the bottom line.
Nothing lived up to the hype. So a lot of anger, a lot of rage. I remember once my wife and I got in an argument, and our little daughter was there, and I had so much rage, I blew up. And I remember I reared back, and boom, I kicked a hole right through our living room wall. And our daughter's crying, and my wife's crying. It's like, hey, that was my life. In fact, I'm going to tell you the ugliest thing about me, which is when my little daughter, Allison, was just a toddler. If she was alone in the living room, playing with some blocks or toys or whatever, and she would hear me come home from work through the front door, her natural reaction was just to gather her toys and go in her room and shut the door. Is she going to be drunk again? Is she going to be yelling and screaming and kicking holes in things? You know what? At least it's nice and quiet in here. Friends, that is the ugliest truth about me. My wife was agnostic.
Before he talks about his wife being agnostic, when I was a young Christian, I used to look at guys like him, like Lee Strobel, the drunken, the profane, and I just thought, oh man, they just need Jesus. They're missing out, and this is why they are the way they are. And when I grew up, I started meeting people who were non-believers who didn't act that way. And, there's many, many reasons why that's the case, but some of it could be just pure intelligence. Some of it could be just a really rough background growing up. Some of it could be, poverty where you are in life, financially. And so I know Lee said from the up front that not all atheists are like this, but he's painting this picture for his Christian minions that this is what atheists are like. They're hedonists, they're drunkards, they can't find meaning in their life, and they're desperate. And they're poor fathers. Here he's painting a picture of his own daughter running to her room to seek refuge from him. And I don't think he's doing this purposely. Lee, but I think he's definitely not helping the fact that he's painting this picture for believers of how they view non-believers.
She didn't know what to think about God. And so one day we moved into a condo outside Chicago, and the woman downstairs was a Christian. And this woman, Linda, became best friends with my wife, Leslie. And it was very natural for Linda to talk to Leslie about God because God was such an important part of her life. And Leslie wasn't hostile toward this stuff. Nobody had ever told her this stuff before. So she asked questions. She went to church with her. She checked it out. Finally, after many months of checking things out, Leslie came up to me one day and said, Lee, I made a big decision. I said, what? She said, I've decided to become a follower of Jesus Christ. And I thought, oh no. You know, as an atheist, this is the worst possible news, you know, that you could get. Honestly, the first word that went through my mind, divorce. I didn't sign up for this. I don't want to be married to some holy roller. I mean, honestly, I was going to walk out, but I stuck around. And what shocked me is in the following months, I began to see positive changes in her character and her values and the way she related to me and the children. And it was winsome and it was attractive. And so finally, one Sunday morning, I'm sleeping off a hangover and she's getting ready to go to church. And she looks at me and she says, Lee, why don't you come to church with me today?
I just want to make the comment that his wife is agnostic. And I have no idea how much she believed or didn't believe about this God belief idea, but she became a Christian because of a friend, and he's noticing a positive difference in her life. And that is one of the reasons why he agreed to go to church with her, as we will soon hear. But the question I would ask Lee is, okay, Lee, if your wife met a friend in that apartment complex who was a Muslim and became really good friends, and your wife became a Muslim, and you saw the similar positive changes in your wife's life because she's now a Muslim, would you have gone to a mosque with her? And would you potentially be a Muslim today because of it? Does seeing positive changes in one's life mean that the what they attribute the source of that positive change, does that actually make it true? Or is that more...
Or what if...
Go ahead.
What if she just started taking a lot of yoga classes? He went with her to like yoga.
Yeah, you're right. There could be other factors. Maybe that was a time in life where, I don't know, she got in better shape and took care of her body better and mentally and physically. And maybe that was the reason for the positive changes in her life, and it had nothing to do with this Jesus belief. But these are the questions I think a lot of atheists automatically think of, but should ask guys like Lee when they meet him, or are followers of Jesus who like guys like Lee. These are the thoughts that should be coming to their head. It's like, and there's an assumption that this is the reason why there was positive changes in their life.
I mean, you had that similar experience when you deconverted.
Yes, exactly. and that's the exact reason why I tell everybody they should deconvert as well, because look at the positive changes in my life. No, I'm kidding. That's a bad reason.
I want to just say that my prediction so far seems to be correct.
Yes.
You know what? I'm going to go. Get around this cult, that she's involved in. So I went with her to a church that was meeting about a mile from my house in a movie theater. And the pastor gets up to preach. And he was a young guy. I don't even think he was shaven yet. His name was Bill Hybels. And he gave a talk called Basic Christianity.
Bill Hybels
and
is
I'm
the
sitting
famous
there, and it was like he was
preacher.
just knocking down one after the other my misconceptions about the Christian faith. And I remember walking out that day saying two things. Number one, I was still an atheist. He did not convince me that day that God exists. But number two, I realized if this stuff is true, this has huge implications for my life, duh. So I decided that day, take my legal training, take my journalism training, and systematically investigate, is there any credibility to Christianity or any other world religion? And I launched on what turned out to be a nearly 2-year investigation of the evidence. Now, as I began that investigation, one thing became very clear very quickly, and that's this. If you want to get to the bottom line, is Christianity true? Then it all boils down to one question. You know what it is?
Yep.
Did Jesus or did he not return from the dead? That's the ball game. Why? Because in a variety of different ways, Jesus made transcendent and messianic and divine claims about himself. He claimed to be the Son of God. At one point in John 10, verse 30, he gets up before a crowd and he says, I and the Father are one. And the word...
Okay, just some theology for you guys. I understand completely what he's saying here. In fact, Paul even says that if Jesus didn't rise from the dead, then all Christianity is in vain. It's bogus. But there is a hidden fallacy in what he just said. He basically said that he's implying that if Jesus did in fact rise from the dead, that makes all of Christianity true. But that's a fallacy. I don't think that we can say that. You could still say...
Yeah, I think...
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, well, I think what you're just about to say is, if Jesus did not rise from the dead, that speaks very poorly towards Christianity. But if Jesus did rise from the dead, it doesn't necessarily speak positively towards Christianity, just towards Jesus, who made claims about Christianity, rising from the dead.
Yeah,
like he could have been some evil demonic cult worshiper who claimed that Christianity was what he was preaching, and then had this very dark magic thing going on to help him rise from the dead. Like, there's a lot of ways somebody could rise from the dead, but the claims that Christianity makes are centered around that. So if they didn't happen, then that's a foundational part of it that's knocked out.
Yeah, well said.
The word in Greek for one is not masculine, it's neuter, which means Jesus was not saying I and the Father are the same person. He was saying I and the Father are the same thing. We're one in nature, we're one in essence. And how did the audience understand what he was saying? They picked up stones to kill him because they said, you, a mere man, are claiming to be God. So Jesus claimed to be the Son of God, but so what? I could claim to be the Son of God. You could claim, anybody could claim to be the Son of God. But if Jesus claimed to be the Son of God, died, and then 3 days later rose from the dead, that's pretty good evidence he's telling the truth, right? That's why the resurrection is the linchpin of the Christian faith.
But what about the other, forget the whole rising from the dead thing, walking on water, turning water to wine, turning rocks into bread, and all those things that those are not qualifiers enough. I mean, you got to come back from the dead. That's the nail in the coffin for you being a god.
And the weird thing about that is isn't rising from the dead not that extraordinary of a thing according to the biblical times, as opposed to the actual individual miracles?
You're exactly right. There was many claims of people rising from the dead back then. In fact, when Jesus died, the Gospel of Matthew says that the graves were opened, or is it the Gospel of John? The graves were opened and dead people walked out, and it could have been hundreds. It said just many walked around. So there was a lot of resurrections back there. But I don't know if you guys noticed this, but he said if Jesus made these claims, he's acknowledging, and I appreciate that about Lee, he's acknowledging that there's a possibility that this guy named Jesus, as depicted in the Gospels, may not have made any of these claims to begin with. That a book just says he did. Now, he did use the word if, but I do really appreciate that he's actually saying that maybe the claims were not even made in the first place.
Apostle Paul puts it this way in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 17. He said, and if Christ has not been raised, your faith is futile. You're still in your sins. In other words, this is the ball game. So here's what I want to do. For the next couple minutes, I just want to hit the highlights of the evidence that I encountered during this 2-year investigation. And I'm going to do it using 4 words that begin with the letter E. That way it's easy to remember. And I want to emphasize, when I did this investigation, I did not give the New Testament any special consideration. any special value. I didn't consider it to be the Word of God, didn't consider it to be inerrant or inspired. I do now, but I was a skeptic then. But I had to accept the New Testament for what it undeniably is, which is a set of ancient historical writings.
Okay, this is what this is
a big disconnect here.
Yeah, this is a huge flaw in thinking, right? He's saying I did not view the Gospels or the New Testament as inspired or God's word, but I viewed it for what it was, undeniably a historical document. Undeniably a historic. This is the first. Now, I don't know exactly what he was thinking when he was not a believer and still an atheist at the time, if he was indeed an atheist. I'm skeptical about that. There are good reasons to believe that the Gospels are not historical narrative, but rather literary works. I will concede one exception. Luke is sort of historical-ish, the Gospel of Luke. But the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, those two, you can see irony, you can see foreshadowing, you can see the parables, you can see a lot of literary technique within those. So when he says it's undeniable that these are historical works of ancient works, no, that it is deniable. You can make a case for that it may not be historical. Maybe some of it is, maybe some of it isn't, but that's no different than any other screenplay or document.
Even he's making the claim. I mean, by him making the claim, doesn't he also have, since he is a legal expert, the burden of proof? I mean, just because he says, I mean, what evidence does he never describes that he found evidence that this is historical documentation?
Okay, so let's listen on. I could say so much, but
I knew, just as you can investigate ancient writings by Suetonius or Tacitus or Josephus or any other ancient writer, you can take those same investigative techniques and apply them to the New Testament to try to determine, is it telling me the truth? So in other words, I didn't just open the Bible and says Jesus is resurrected, end of story. I wanted to dig beneath that. How do I know it really happened? So what are the 4 words that summarize the evidence for the resurrection? The first E stands for the word execution. You have to have a death, right, before you can have a resurrection. And what I learned about the execution of Jesus is that there is no dispute about this among scholars in the field. And I'm not just talking about Christian scholars. I'm talking about the wide range of scholarship. There's virtual unanimity on the fact historically that Jesus was crucified and killed under Pontius Pilate. Why?
Okay, he kind of, I don't want to use the word contradiction, but he said virtually. And then he used the words, it's undeniable that everyone agrees that Jesus was crucified. Yes and no is what I would say to that. There are historians out there who say that Jesus was indeed crucified, but it wasn't on earth. It was in a heavenly realm, the third heaven. Guys like Carrier, basically the ancient, the mythicists, what Christians would call the mythicist historians. Now I do agree, they make a small percentage of historians, but they are out there, and they do claim that this is not a bodily resurrection. Then you got Jews, and Muslims who will also say that, no, this is not a bodily, or the Muslims, in fact, say that he wasn't even crucified, that he wasn't killed. So it's not undeniable. There are people who disagree about this.
Why is it not controversial? Because when we study ancient history, one of the things we learn is we're lucky if we have one or maybe 2 sources to confirm a fact. And yet, for the execution of Jesus, we not only have multiple early first-century accounts of this in the documents that make up the New Testament, we've got 5 ancient sources outside the Bible confirming and corroborating his execution.
I can't help but cringe when I hear this, because I think you guys know what I'm going to say, but when he talks about extra-biblical corroboration of the crucifixion of Jesus. These are people, sometimes a century later, just stating what Christians believed back then. Were they eyewitnesses to a crucifixion? No. Were they there? Did they even live in the same time period? No. And so he's making it sound like, and I gave this example in my Frank Turek video, that imagine a historian in the late 1800s writing, it's undeniable that Joseph Smith got the words from God on these tablets. Well, that corroborates Joseph Smith's story then, doesn't it? Mormonism must be true. No, it's just a historian talking about what the belief was at that time. And so if Lee Strobel is promoting himself as a skeptic, someone who doesn't take things at face value, you would think he would think about these things. But it seems like he didn't. And I don't know if I don't know. I shouldn't be too harsh on him because I haven't read his books, but I've watched a lot of his videos, and it seems to me, when he was talking about multiple sources for the crucifixion, ancient historians say that we have the Gospel of Mark written first, and that whoever wrote the book of Matthew, and most historians don't think it was guys named Mark, Matthew, and John, they had the book of Mark in front of them when they wrote Matthew. And when John's gospel was written, or Luke's gospel was written, that the book of Mark and Matthew was open when Luke's gospel was written. So these are not independent sources. At best, we might have one when it comes to the gospels, one source. And Paul is maybe a second source, but he doesn't mention anything about the historical Jesus, more the big picture stuff. But anyhow.
You have Josephus, a first-century Jewish historian who worked for the Romans. Tacitus, another early historian. Even the Jewish Talmud admits that Jesus was executed.
Again, guys, guess when the Josephus wrote all the other sources. I think there's like 10 total. When do you think these sources wrote? Jesus apparently was crucified in 33 AD. Take a guess.
100 AD, 200 AD.
Well, if he's telling the truth in his first century, then between 33 and 100 somewhere.
Yeah, he's only
or he's just lying.
He is mostly lying. No, sorry, that's harsh. He's mostly incorrect. He because lying assumes motive. He is right for Josephus. Josephus is around 93 AD. But all the rest is post 100, second century. And I think some of it's even third century. So we're talking, and the average lifespan back then was 45 years old. We're talking lifetimes later. We have this so-called corroboration of the facts, in quotes.
Friends, this is such a well-established historical fact. You would get laughed out of a major academic institution if you somehow claim, no, Jesus wasn't executed. In fact, you can go to an atheist New Testament scholar like Gerd Ludamann of Vanderbilt University, and this is what he will tell you based on the historical evidence. Quote, Jesus' death as a consequence of crucifixion is indisputable. Indisputable. Now, I don't know how much you've studied ancient history, but there are very few facts in ancient history that a skeptical, critical, atheist historian like a Gerd Ludamann will say is indisputable.
Okay, I'm
one
one
of them. Is the death
Can I Google this?
Yes,
guy?
yeah, Google him if you want.
What's his name again?
It's German. And I got a lot to say about this. Gerd Ludamann, I don't even know how to spell his first name, but Ludamann is Luddemann, but I could be wrong about that. And it's Gerd, G-A...
Hold on, Luddeman.
Let me see if I can find it. But here's the point. This is a very, very important point. Most ancient biblical historians are believers. And those who are, their employment is for usually Christian colleges, universities, and so forth. I would dare to say that most of these ancient historians sign statements or confessions of faith in order to work where they work. And there's a reason why I'm bringing this up, because he quotes Ludamann. Ludamann lives in Germany. His native tongue is German. He doesn't debate very much because his English is so poor. And most debates are in English. And he actually got demoted. He used to believe like other scholars believe, but he changed his mind fairly early in his career, and he got demoted. He didn't get fired, though, and this is in Germany. And but you take a huge risk when you are an historian and you say, you know what, we could even question the crucifixion, or we can doubt certain things that Jesus said in the Bible. By the way, Ludamann believes that only 15% of the so-called things that Jesus said were actually said by Jesus, because we do not, as Lee Strobel admits, we do not have two or more corroborating sources. So he says we cannot know. We have to be agnostic about it, of whether Jesus even said these words. And Lee would have to agree with that. If you don't have two or more sources for something, then you have a good reason to doubt it. And so yeah, that's my rant on that.
I got his Wikipedia page. Gerd Ludamann is a German New Testament scholar. He taught this subject from, 1983 to 99 at the Faculty of Theology of the University of Göttingen. Since 99, he has taught there with a special status as Chair of History and Literature of Early Christianity. He's married with 4 children and 7 grandchildren. I did research at McMaster University and Vanderbilt. He was appointed in 83 to the chair of New Testament Studies and Theological Faculty of the University of Göttingen.
Yeah, very few Christians that I have read or heard dispute Ludamann's credentials. And this is exactly why Lee Strobel is bringing him up, because he is a respected scholar. But he's a respected scholar who does say, yes, the crucifixion did most likely. Again, here's another important point that a lot of people don't realize. The job of a historian is to figure out what probably happened in the past. That's the job of a historian, what probably happened in the past. So miracle claims, by definition, are the least probable event. So how in the world, if a historian's job is to figure out what most probably happened in the past, how can a historian even entertain the idea that as a historian, professional historian, that's something improbable was most probable?
But isn't a historian, an academic historian, bound by sort of the same rules as a scientist would be? So you should be able to get different historians with different backgrounds, different biases, all to be able to come to the same conclusion as to whether a historical event was probable or not improbable.
Yeah, I'm going to make a claim here, and I usually don't make claims, but I'm going to claim that when Christians, if you're listening, whenever you hear an apologist say, like William Lane Craig, most scholars say X or believe X, I'm going to claim that they have no basis to say that, because I have scoured and scoured and scoured the internet and other resources asking, how do we know this, that most scholars believe X or say X? Have they surveyed like a pool of 1,000 scholars and is that database of their names and what they believe about what probably happened in the past, is it out there? Is there a database out there? Habermas is a historian who claims he does have a database, but he has not released it publicly. No one has seen it. And so, and the question is, if a scholar is asked a question, do you believe Jesus said X? And then this guy named Habermas says, okay, this number said yes, and this number said no. But does he include the number of scholars who say, I don't know, we just don't know, I'm agnostic about it? He could have, he could not. We have no evidence to say either way. Does he include that in his data? And I have a feeling that the answer is no. And William Lane Craig is a popular apologist who quotes this Habermas guy who says most scholars say this, when they exclude probably the majority of scholars who just say, we have to be agnostic about it, we just don't know. And so I beg Christians to consider this when they hear their favorite apologists say, oh, it's just undeniable that most scholars say this regarding this particular point. I would say you should be a skeptic and question that if you value truth. I love appealing to Christians and truth because they value truth greatly. So if you value truth, you should be thinking about these things. Ought to. There's an ought for you.
Jesus, the first E is for execution. Jesus was dead. The second E stands for the word early. We have early reports or early accounts that Jesus rose from the dead. In other words, reports that come virtually immediately after the event. Why is that important? Because I used to think, like a lot of skeptics, that there was a huge time gap between the death of Jesus and maybe 100, 150, 200 years later, legends developing about mythologies and stories were invented a long time later. I knew it took a long time for legend to develop in the ancient world. So I figured 150, 200 years after the fact, people made up stories about Jesus. That's what I thought. But what I learned, I think, decimates the claim that the resurrection is merely a legend. Follow me on this. I think this is powerful. We have preserved for us a creed of the earliest church, a statement of conviction that the first Christians, right there in the first century, would rally around based on facts that they knew to be true. This creed contains the essence of Christianity. It says that Jesus died. Why? For our sins. He was buried. On the third day, he rose again from the dead. And then it mentions the specific names of individuals, including an opponent and skeptic, and groups of people to whom Jesus appeared. Now, and their lives were changed 180 degrees as a result.
Do you guys have any thoughts about what he's saying so far about the early dating?
I don't even care to dispute anything that he said so far. Like, to me, you don't have to. Like, all this stuff can be true, and it doesn't matter. It doesn't say much to me. Okay, so he's saying that this person died, or no, he's saying that there are writings of this person died, and there's more than one writing of this person dying, and then there's more than one writing of this person coming back from the dead. Okay, so this convinces you that it actually happened because multiple people wrote about a similar thing. Like, okay, then what else do we have to believe now if this is our criteria for evidence of truth? Like, I guess every single alien abduction or UFO sighting is now also true. Like, I suppose every other religion and all their fantastical claims now are also true. Like, this is the stuff that we have when people are talking about things that they were convinced of, not things that are actually true.
Yeah, I would agree with that. But he's making a point about the dates of the writings, and he says this is important because when he was a skeptic, he believed that the stories about Jesus were legendized. And I would agree with him. I do see a lot of the Gospels. When you look at the first Gospel to the last Gospel, there's more miracles. Jesus is becoming more grand, more godlike. You read Mark, you read John, you see a huge difference. And Christians don't see it. I do. But so this is why he's bringing up that point. He's basically saying, oh, you can't make up a legend in 20 years. Oh, really, Lee? You cannot legendize something in just 20 years? Have you heard of Mormonism? Have you heard of, I can't pronounce it, but he's a East Indian guru named Saita Sayaba. I think I'm pronouncing it right. There are people that you could talk to who are alive today who will say that this guy who's now passed on committed many, many miracles, and they saw it with their own eyes. 1 million people showed up to this guy's birthday party. He's not just this small-time miracle worker. There's been a lot of writings about this guy. There's been a lot of eyewitnesses of this guy. Does this mean that this guy was truly supernatural? And this is, I think, the point Billy's making. It's like, no, it doesn't. But let's listen on. Do you have any thoughts, Pete?
No, you guys pretty much summed it up.
Now, what's important is how immediately after the execution of Jesus, this creed developed. Remember we said it took a long time for legend to develop? Well, get this. The Apostle Paul preserves this creed for us in a letter that he wrote to the church in Corinth about 22 to 25 years after the death of Jesus.
That's correct.
And he says, I already gave you this creed. So sometime within that, say 22 to 25 years, this creed was already in existence. Now, that's pretty impressive historically, but we can go back even earlier. Because Paul used to be Saul of Tarsus, a persecutor of Christians. 1 to 3 years after the execution of Jesus, he's on the road to Damascus. Boom, he has this encounter with the risen Christ. He becomes the Apostle Paul. He immediately goes into Damascus. Some scholars believe this was the point at which he was given this creed. But other scholars say, no, it was probably 3 years later. 3 years later, Paul goes into Jerusalem and he meets for 15 days with two people specifically named in the creed, Peter and James. And the Greek word he uses to describe this meeting in Galatians, hysterio, means this was an investigative inquiry. We weren't talking about the Cubs. We weren't talking about the snow. We were talking about what's important. What do you know happened? What did you see? What did you experience? What did you touch? What do you know for a fact? They were checking each other out. Most scholars will say this was the point at which Paul was given the creed. But either way, it means within 1 to 6 years after the death of Jesus, this creed is given to Paul, and therefore the beliefs that make up that creed go back even earlier, virtually to the cross itself.
Oh, where to start with this? It's
This is just getting very preachy.
Yeah, he gets off this in a bit, but so again, for people who came in late who are watching right now, we got 27 people watching. Billy and Pete have never heard of Lee Strobel, never watched anything, so I wanted to get their reaction of Lee Strobel and his coming from atheism into Christianity. But his point here is, look, Paul wrote in the mid-50s, 20-some years after the event, but he's claiming that, it's even better than that because Paul was talking about this creed that he got a year or 3 years after it actually happened, but he just happened to write about it 20 years later. And the first point, the obvious point is, that doesn't mean the creed is true. That's an obvious point. Whether it's 1 year or 20 years, it doesn't mean that whatever was reported is true. I hope every human being listening to this can agree with that. Just because something's written about doesn't make it true, whether it's 1 year or 20 years. Second point is, Paul himself in his letters admits that everything he knows about Jesus, he did not learn from other men. He learned it through direct revelation from God Almighty himself. It's in Galatians. So that is, the Bible's contradicting what Lee Strobel's saying right now. And I bring this up with Christians often, and they feel very uncomfortable when I do. But it is, you read the Galatians for yourself, and it says that what Paul learned about Jesus, he did not get from other men. Paul wasn't there. He never saw the crucifixion or the resurrection, at least not in bodily form. He didn't, according to him, everything he knew, he got from revelation, not from other people.
In fact, one of the greatest scholars in this area, James D.G. Dunn, said this. He said, this tradition, this creed, we can be entirely confident was formulated as a creed, as tradition, within months of Jesus' life. Within months. This is historical gold. When you consider that one of the greatest classical historians who ever lived, A.N. Sherwin White of Oxford, studied the rate at which legend developed in the ancient world, and he determined that the passage of 2 generations of time is not even enough for legend to grow up and wipe out a solid core of historical truth. We don't have 2 generations of time passing here. We got newsflash. It goes right back to the beginning. Friends, it would be unprecedented in the history of the world for a legend to develop that fast and wipe out a solid core of historical truth.
Okay, I'm going to do a little SC here. So, Billy, let's pretend this guy is right here with us, Lee Strobel. I would ask Lee Strobel, what would change your mind about legends developing quickly? Like, if it were true, Lee, that a legend could develop in 10 years, would that change your beliefs? Would you start doubting your Christianity? I think that's a good question to ask. Billy, can you think of a better one?
Like, to me, this is the stuff that starts to make me want to zone out, because it's all of this is just boring, like, irrelevancy to me. It's like, oh, so you're gonna, how long are you gonna continue to tell me that the people who believed in this stuff like to talk about their beliefs and write it down? That's what it sounds like to me. Is you're just telling me that the people who believe that that in this stuff kept writing it down and talking to other people who also like to write it down, and now this convinces you that what they believed is true, but it's not doing anything for me. Like, it's just.
But Billy, that's excellent. I appreciate you saying that, because on the small chance that a guy like Lee Strobel will get this type of feedback, here we have an agnostic atheist named Billy saying, look, this is so what information you're telling me. But Lee might respond to you back, Billy, saying, well, this message is actually not for you. It's for Christians. And but here's what I would say if he responded that way. I would say, why do you feel the need to tell your fellow Christians this information? And the answer is, I think, because Christians doubt way more than they let on. And the job of an apologist is to help curtail that doubt. The job of an apologist is the exact opposite of you and me, Billy. We like increasing doubt, being open to being wrong, questioning. The job of an apologist is to say, no, what you believe, I know sometimes you feel stupid believing this, but you don't have to, because look, it was written so close to the time of the events, and you do have good reasons to believe this. Don't worry, you're not dumb, you're not crazy, you're not delusional. It's going to be okay. This is the job of an apologist, to basically to curb these types of emotions.
Like, what this makes me want to say is, okay, this stuff. Let's even say that maybe your God and religion existed back then, and all that stuff was true back then. That doesn't even convince me that he's around anymore. So let's pretend that all information that we've ever known was wiped. What can you now find to prove to me that it's still true? Because I'm pretty sure that if we continued the science stuff, we'd figure it out all over again. We'd keep finding it out. But what would you be able to find today that would convince me that this belief is true, when you have no 2,000-year-old evidence that you're still trying to say, look at it today, look at it today?
That is an excellent point. So imagine, here's a great thought experiment. Every person on the planet loses their God belief. Call it a selective amnesia, okay? So tomorrow morning, everybody wakes up on this planet. No one has any God belief. No one knows anything about it. Allah, Yahweh, Buddha, Vishnu, nothing. And in fact, let's add to it. And we lose all our science knowledge as well. We don't know how to do science. We're starting from square one. What Billy is saying is he predicts that in let's say, several hundred years, science would come back. But the idea of Jesus or Vishnu may not. In fact, probably wouldn't. Because we can't look to transformed lives and say, oh yeah, this is Jesus. There's nothing, unless maybe Jesus would come back and reveal himself. I guess then maybe it would happen. But yeah, that's an excellent point. And Billy, don't be scared to say this is boring, because that's useful to let Christians. There's Christians who will be listening to this video who want to reach people like you, Billy. And by you saying, I'm zoning out when I'm hearing Lee talk here, you're helping them. You're helping them know how to interact with you and me in a better, more productive manner.
Yeah, all I've been hearing so far is the best evidence we have was 2,000 years ago.
Yeah.
But like that's not really like that's not significant to me. Is if that's really your crown jewel.
But Billy,
comes from 2,000 years ago.
No, but Billy, you don't understand. I feel Jesus in my life every day, Billy. He walks with me. That would be more interesting if he says, so here's what I discovered yesterday. Here is my evidence. Here is what happened. Here is the test that I was able to confirm in this past month with my fellow friends. Now let's actually get into how did you actually test something and discover real evidence of your belief? I don't want to hear a 2,000-year-old history essay on what people wrote. I want to see like, all right, now let's see some tests here. Let's see a way for you to confirm or disconfirm whether or not what you're believing is true. If your belief is true, this is what we should expect. Billy, you don't understand.
Where's that?
Billy, the evidence is right in front of you, Billy. I was a drunkard. I'm speaking for Lee. I've never been a drunkard. Well, with Reed one night on election night, but that's another story. But my life has changed, Billy. There's the evidence. My wife's life's changed. There's the evidence for you. What more do you need?
Okay, is that convincing evidence to you?
Of course it is.
Should I be convinced by? Yeah. So you're saying people should be convinced if people's life gets changed by a belief that they have, that the belief is true.
If you go from being a wretched, profane, drunkard human being to overnight being not touching a bottle and loving people and caring for them, isn't that strong evidence that something transcendent has overcome you?
Okay, then is that evidence that what they believe helped them overcome is true?
Well, what else could it be?
All right, then. Do you think there are any Muslims that have had this experience after believing in Muslim, the drunkard Muslims? Do you believe there are any supernaturalists, naturalists or supernaturalists of New Agey people that have come to like this New Age hippie group and then help them discover a new path and become a happier person? All those beliefs now you have to believe them. If you're going to be consistent, believe all that too.
Yeah, and so if you're a Christian or a Muslim watching this, please know that when we hear personal testimonies of transformed lives, that guys like Billy and I, we're happy for you, and we actually think, yeah, if you've gone from stealing and killing or whatever, and you stop that, we like that. That's good. But that doesn't mean that your God is responsible for it or is the reason why you stopped. Maybe the belief is, but that doesn't mean that the truth behind the belief is actually true or exists. And Billy's pointing out that
I think Mormons probably hold a higher position in the truthiness of their beliefs if this is your criteria.
Or Jainists, like Jainists or pacifists, they wouldn't hurt a fly. Like they're loving, they're caring. Not all Jainists, of course, but you look at the Mormons, the Jainists, other what Christians would call cults. If we're going by transformed lives and how they interact with their fellow man and woman, then those would be the most truest religions out there. So transformed lives, I'm going to just say it, means nothing to the truth of the claim. Nothing. I know that hurts to hear it, but I'm trying to send it home.
You're going to be the next atheist preacher, Doug.
Can I get an amen?
You can do what he does.
Have you even read any of the Gospels, Billy?
Not of my own accord.
Okay. I encourage you to.
I went to Catholic school. like for 4 years, 5 years as a kid, and I'm sure that I've had them lectured at me, and we've had religion classes and Bible studies and stuff, but I don't remember none of that connected strongly with me.
Okay, I'm going to read you something, but as one atheist to another atheist, I'm going to encourage you I know you're a busy guy, but I want to encourage you to actually read one of the Gospels. You can choose. Actually, start with Mark, because that's the first Gospel written. I sincerely encourage you to do that and just get a flavor for how it reads, what are your impressions, and so forth. You don't have to read the whole thing, but just read the first few chapters. And after you do that, I want you to remember what I'm about to read to you now, because very rarely do people get to hear what a true ancient historian reads like from the ancient times. So I'm going to read for you something written by Suetonius in about 1st century BC. Now, he's a historian. Now, if you're a Christian, please listen carefully to this. This is what a historical record sounds like for that time period. And then I want you to compare and contrast in your mind to the gospel narrative. Gaius Caesar was born the day before the Calids of September in the consulship of his father Gaius Capito. Conflicting testimonies make his birthplace uncertain. Gnaeus Lentus writes that he was born at Tibur. Pliny the Elder that he was born among the Triveria in a village called Amivarium, above the confluence. Pliny adds as proof that altars are shown there inscribed for the delivery of Agrippa. Verses which were in circulation soon after he became emperor indicate that he was begotten in the winter quarters of the legions. He who was born in the camp and reared mid the arms of the country gave at the outset a sign that he was fated to rule. I myself find in the Acta Publica that he first saw the light at Antium. Gatius was shown to be wrong by Pliny, who says that he told a flattering lie to add some luster to the fame of the young and vainglorious prince from the city of sacred to Hercules, and then he lied with the more assurance because of, and so on. But you get the gist, the flavor of what history sounds like back then. This is actual translated into English. A historian named Suetonius in the first, maybe even 2nd century BC. Let me read a few more lines. Furthermore, we have a letter written by Augustus to his granddaughter Agrippa a few months before he died about the Gaius in question, for no other child of the name was still alive at that time, and it reads as follows, and I quote, and then he quotes. Now, if you read the Gospel of Mark, it's going to sound nothing like that. Nothing.
Yeah, I was going to say, this isn't what I thought. At first I thought you were going to read something from the Gospels that was some historian or something. And then after you started reading it, I already got the gist that this is a non-biblical historian.
Now, if there's Christians watching this, they're going to hear this for the very first time in their life, what an actual historian sounds like of that time. Please give me the least credit to acknowledge that it sounds different. And then please know that what makes it different is, and I'm going to quote from Richard Carrier, who is a PhD historian, ancient historian. He specializes in Roman ancient history. But he makes a comment about this Suetonius narrative I just wrote. Suetonius shows how critical historians behave. His methods and critical judgment become transparent and laid out for the reader to see. His names, or at least mentions or describes his sources. He names his sources. Luke, Matthew, Mark, they don't name their sources. God is the source, of course. But anyhow, Carrier goes on. Suetonius, he analyzes the conflicting claims and tells how he decided on one over the other. Indeed, it is already important that he tells us that they were conflicting traditions. He lists the evidence and criticizes it. He gives us information about the reliability of his sources. For instance, he tells us that when a source is anonymous and admits that this is a mark against it. He tells us that what evidence any given author appealed to and remarks on the possible motives. He quotes documents or sources verbatim. He is openly attentive to chronological inconsistencies. Now, Carrier talks about the Gospel of Luke, which is the most historical Gospels out of all of them. But listen to what Carrier says about Luke in contrast to Suetonius. Luke does none of these things. He never mentions his method, much less shows his methods to us, or any critical judgment. He never names even a single source, nor does he give us anything like a useful description of any of his sources, and he certainly never tells us in which sources he used and which details of his history. And Luke must surely have known that they were conflicting claims, yet he never tells us about them. But instead, he narrates his account as if everything was indisputable, never once telling us how or why he chose one version or detail, and I could go on. But if you're a Christian listening to this, that should put the fear of God in you. No pun intended. Because I have just read for you something of that time period, which sounds a lot like what a historian would write, and contrast it to what Luke has done, or any other gospel for that matter. And you can clearly hear it's different. And you're left with the question, okay, is what I'm reading from the Gospels history? Or maybe it's literature. Maybe it's both. I personally think it's a screenplay because good screenplays has some history, some true facts mixed in with analogies or fiction. It is his... I'm going to just blanket say this. Most historians will admit to you, even a lot of Christian ones, that the Gospels are not eyewitness accounts and not written by the names attributed to them. If this is news to you, if you're a Christian hearing this for the first time, don't take my word for it. Go investigate it for yourself. Don't run to your favorite apologist to get these answers. Do it yourself. But anyhow. I don't think we need to go on. I took an hour of your time, and I know you got work to do. But
yeah, I mean, it started off more interesting, and then like once he actually got into here's the evidence, I was like, oh, well, this is boring now. Like this isn't the evidence I was hoping for.
What evidence were you hoping for?
Something a little bit more modern, I guess.
Yeah, but the thing is, the Christian would say, well, that's impossible, Billy, because it happened 2,000 years ago. So what do you expect? This is the best we have.
So what you're telling me is that your religion hasn't been active for 2,000 years. Like there's been no impact of your religion for 2,000 years.
No, Billy, look,
real world.
We
impact.
wouldn't have science if it wasn't for Christianity.
We wouldn't have science if it wasn't for the Muslims either.
Yeah, it's But what Billy's getting at is extraordinary claims, like someone rising from the dead, requires extraordinary evidence. And, well, that's just the best they had back then, is written texts. That doesn't cut it. Sorry. I'll do my Canadian accent. Because the claim of someone rising and the claim of belief in this person gives you eternal salvation. That is such an extraordinary claim that we just can't say, oh, well, okay, some ancient documents said this is the case, so I guess it's true. No.
Is he a young Earth or old Earth?
He's a young earther, I believe. Well, he's definitely a creationist. Whether he believes the 6 days means millions or billions of years, I don't know. But what Christians will tell you, Billy, is, yeah, the evidence is 2,000 years ago, but Billy, there's attestations, which means there's references to Jesus going, there's thousands and thousands of them, and they go all the way up into the 16th century. So there's that. Does that help you, Billy?
Wait, what does that mean? What? Wait, did Jesus come back in the 16th century? Is that what you're saying?
No. What I'm saying is that you will have these people, some of them great spiritual leaders, priests, rabbis, and so forth, who will attest to these ancient documents as being true.
Oh, so you're saying that it was only 1,500 years old when they were saying it was true. See, 500 years ago, when they talked about the Bible was only 1,500 years old, so it was newer evidence.
Yeah. I want to show you something here before you go. This is a graph of all what's been found of the evidence for the Bible. You see this graph?
Not in detail, but I see bars and color.
Okay. This is centuries on the bottom on the x-axis. Centuries. And these are the number of manuscripts on the y-axis. So big bars mean lots of manuscripts, small bars means little.
Okay.
So basically the evidence that you really don't care about, but Christians do. The evidence of first century documents is, well, here they have 0. But what has been found, that's changed. This is an old graph. I think it's up to 10 now. But basically, second century, like first, like year 100, 150, I think we're up to 10, 12, maybe 15 documents that we found. And these are just fragments, like pieces of the Bible, like sometimes just a sentence or two. And that really doesn't change much. In the 6th century, like in the year 500, we might be approaching 100 pieces or even parts, like paragraphs. But it really doesn't take off until 1,000 years later, of where we actually have something that we can hold in our hands and say, oh yeah, we got big chunks of the New Testament in front of us. This is another thing that when Christians say, oh, there's more manuscripts for Jesus or for the New Testament than any other document, they're not realizing that a lot of these thousands of documents or manuscripts have come upwards of millennia afterwards. A millennia. Now, if we were to take another ancient document and compare time frames, it becomes much more comparing apples to apples. Like Christianity did take off as a popular religion, and that, to me, explains it. But that should, I would think, hopefully, if someone's saying the reason why I believe the evidence is good because of these thousands of manuscripts, and looking at the graph I just put up, should, I hope, just give you a little smudging of doubt that maybe these thousands of manuscripts are not that persuasive, considering that a large majority of them were found like up to 1,000 years later.
He talks about he has to discover, the evidence of that it's true, and the first place to start is the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. It's like, but you've already assumed that there's a creator, and now you're trying to get to which creator is it. Like, I think at the very foundation, what you should really have to start with is, was the earth even created? Now, let's say that it's like, just to contrast how we're going about looking at what evidence means, because this 2,000-year-old historical stuff isn't really that important to me. But let's say for at least 6,000 years, taking his views into account, we have had cells in our bodies. Like, for at least 6,000 years, these things have existed. We don't have any ancient texts to help us discover that these things have been in existence. We don't have 6,000-year-old books that say there are these little tiny cells that carry oxygen throughout your body and do all these different tasks that help us be alive. We don't have that, and we don't need it. It's literally, it doesn't do anything for us, and it would be meaningless too, because we could confirm whether or not that's still true. Our cells in our bodies, we could actually do something about that. Was the earth created? It doesn't matter if we have 2,000-year-old book telling us that the earth was created, we should be able to find that out now. What are we doing to find that out now? And is it actually showing us anything, whether or not it's true?
Yeah, and Lee Strobel would say, yes, we can show it now, because the Big Bang proves that there's a creator. That's what they say. And the reason why they say this is because, well, if the universe had a beginning, then whatever, and if everything that begins has a cause, then that cause has to be outside of time, space, and matter. And that thing, that entity we call God, the creator. Now, my rebuttal to that is very simple. We don't know what happened just before the Big Bang. And the Big Bang is not the creation of the universe per se. In a way it is, but it's the beginning of the expansion of the universe with its known laws. Before the singularity, we can't make any statement. And a lot of...
to me, it's meaningless to talk about anything without... Like, if time is a product of the universe, then nothing happened before the universe. There was nothing happening. Like, it outside of the universe, according to what... If this is your criteria of defining the universe and what it is, and the Big Bang is the existence of time and space and the existence of the universe, then if there was a point where time had not started yet, then there was nothing could have been happening. It doesn't make sense.
Yeah, but again, I think the important point that a lot of theists get wrong when it comes to cosmology and the Big Bang is that we know nothing. I still think we can talk vaguely in terms of before the Big Bang, because time is more than just seconds and minutes. It's, if you have a consciousness, then it's sequential thoughts. And I've actually said to theists that I do believe that if there's a personal God out there, he is bound by time. No, Doug, no, that's not true. Take that back. No, I do believe this, because if he's a personal God, he has thoughts. If he has thoughts, they have to happen sequentially, I would think. Otherwise, he could potentially be contradictory and not at the same time. He could say something, then take it back. Like, if it's not, he could will something, think something, and so you see what I'm saying? Like, there's time in a temporal sense if you have a conscious mind. So temporally, if there is a personal God, then temporally that God is bound by time. In fact, time would be a part of his nature. And I actually even believed this when I was a Christian, and I would freak out my Christian friends by saying this. They just didn't know what to do with it. But when you think of it in terms of before and after, like before the creation of the universe, apparently Yahweh created angels. So you could say before the creation of the universe, God did X. And there was
I think if you're going to say that, then you're acknowledging that time and space exist outside of our universe.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Otherwise, you're saying God never existed anywhere. If God is outside of time and he's outside of space, then there's nowhere that he exists at any time. Like, that's what that means to me. It's an admission of your God does not exist if he's outside space and time, because that's what existence entails, is somewhere at some point.
Okay, I want to wrap this up because I know you want to get to work, but I'm going to first say I could be totally wrong with what I'm about to say. I admit this. I could be wrong. But here's my take on Lee Strobel. Lee Strobel had this huge fight with his dad growing up. He was estranged from his father. That created a void in his life. He met an agnostic woman. I'm going to take his word for it. She was a purely agnostic, whatever that means. Found success in journalism, but still didn't feel fulfilled in his life, probably because of his childhood. Took to the bottle, and I don't know if he calls himself an alcoholic, but sounds like he was an alcoholic. Became an alcoholic. Didn't like his life, was sad. Saw positive changes in his wife when his wife happened to meet another Christian, who maybe his wife was going through a tough time too. And the first person who reaches out a hand and helps you has a high probability of you taking on the beliefs of that person. And so I hear this time and time again, have an addiction, have a wife or a spouse who's a believer, and then you become a believer. In my opinion, this is why Lee Strobel is a Christian today. It has nothing to do with his 2 years investigation. He was already on the road to being a Christian long before he even opened up a research book on Christianity and the case for Christ, because he was sad, depressed, lonely. He needed something. He needed help. And Christianity is what gave it to him. And then he used the apologists' rhetoric to justify what he believed. Oh, I'm going to get a lot of hate comments for all this, what I just said. But I think what I just said is true, because I've seen so many examples of it. And Christians, you have seen examples of what I just said in other religions as well. How could that person be a Mormon? What are they thinking? Well, if you talk to Mormons and I've talked to one guy on Blab who basically said, I was at rock bottom, and I got a knock on the door one day, and it was a Mormon, and they showed me love. They befriended me. They helped me. And wouldn't you know it, this guy today is a Mormon. But that doesn't make Mormonism true, does it? Well, Billy, thanks for giving your nubile insights, not knowing who Lee Strobel was, just giving your impressions of him.
Yeah, I've heard the name plenty of times. I've never actually seen him or heard him talk.
Yeah, he's coming out with a movie this week, and so this is why he was on my radar. And so if you watch my guess is you were not going to watch the movie, but if anybody here listening is going to watch that movie, I hope Billy and I at least raised enough doubt or questions in your mind that when you watch the movie, and I don't know how much he's going to go back into his past and talk about his father and his wife and so forth, but I really think that is the core reason for his belief, is everything that preceded his 2 years of investigation. And yeah. Okay, Billy, I'm going to actually stick around for 1 second. I'm going to stop the live stream, and then I want to talk to you for a second. Okay, thanks everyone in chat for hanging out. I'll probably, I don't know if I'll edit this or not, but it'll stay up for at least a few hours. Take care.